In today's fast-paced global market, understanding your import data is crucial for staying competitive. Meet Tova, the revolutionary Power BI tool designed to transform your import data into actionable insights. With Tova, you have the option to visualize your imports from around the world, analyze tariff classifications, and understand the true cost of your goods. Perform what-if analyses to optimize your supply chain and mitigate costs. Make informed decisions with reliable, accurate data at your fingertips. Join leading enterprises already leveraging Tova to navigate the complexities of global trade and customs compliance. Contact us today to get started on your journey.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Tariffs and Trade in Focus. We have the next hour together, hopefully, and I'll kick us off. I'm Mike Abbott, partner here at BDO, and I have the absolute pleasure of hosting this roundtable discussion, which is really some unprecedented times. But really, before we start and we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we're on today. While we meet on a virtual platform, I'd like to take a moment to recognize the importance of the lands we each call home. This acknowledgement reaffirms our commitment and responsibility to improving relationships between nations and deepening our understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their culture. I'm coming today from Ottawa, which is situated on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. So welcome. Where do we start? We met 2 months ago, a couple of days before the inauguration, and it certainly feels like a couple of years has passed given how many things have changed. And some of the words that I'll throw out there, there's certainly a high level of uncertainty that I think everyone is feeling. We see it come out in a couple of ways. We see clients delaying decisions. We see a level of paralysis happening around what to do next, where to turn to. We also have some clients that have found opportunity in the chaos, things that they didn't expect. We see shifting and challenges to interprovincial trade barriers. And we see, I'm going to say, an unprecedented pace of potential regulatory change, which we know all of these things do not always land well in the economy. We've seen it turn up in different ways through the stock market. And what we'd like to do is over the next hour is just share some different insights. And of course, through all of this here in Canada, we've got an election, looks like it's coming, and we'll certainly hear from one of our panelists on that topic. But I'd like to introduce our panel. I'm joined and happily joined by 3 different individuals. Brian Morcom, a partner in our tax group. And Brian, I'm going to hand it over to you and get you to introduce yourself, and then I'll take us through the rest.
Thanks, Mike. Brian Morcom, broadcasting from our national office, 20 Wellington Street in Toronto. Very pleased to be here. And I lead the global indirect tax practice, as well as the national indirect tax service line. That includes customs and international trade services, although I am trumped by my colleague, our director and leader of our customs and international trade service line, who you'll be hearing from in just a moment. But it also includes goods and services tax, harmonized sales tax, provincial sales taxes, digital services tax, luxury tax, underused housing tax. So we support a variety of service needs of our clients that extends generally beyond the Income Tax Act, say that. And again, Mike, really pleased to be here to talk about what we're hearing from clients, in particular in respect of tariff readiness and supply chain.
Great. And I know I got a few questions for you as we go through this, so Brian will have you back. Charmaine, I'm going to bring you on stage. And if you can introduce yourself.
Hello. I see what you did there, Brian. I see what you did there. Keep my eyes on you. So hello to everyone. For those that I have not met before or haven't seen my face, because it's been out there a lot lately. My name is Charmaine Gadaris, and I lead the Customs International Trade practice here at BDO Canada. I'm actually part of a larger global group of customs consultants at BDO Global. There's about 75 of us, and we have consultants in every major trading country around the world. So my role here at BDO Canada is to help guide companies through and make sure they're adhering to the various customs rules, laws, and legislation while mitigating any type of duty exposure. And lately, my main focus has been helping guide companies through the uncertainties of the current trade war so that they can not only survive but thrive.
Perfect. And before I bring Scott out, I just want to say one thing, Charmaine. I know you and I we trade a lot of notes each day, and the range of questions that clients are asking, even in preparation for those of you who registered and asked some questions, whether it be through customs and excise tax questions, international questions, transfer pricing, mergers and acquisitions, questions of what do you do around strategy, what do you do around creating value for an organization, cost optimization, risk management. All of those questions are coming, and we see it in the marketplace. And so we'll spend a bit of time as a group to share some of those insights. But I'm gonna introduce our third panelist, and he joined us 2 months ago, and not much has happened, Scott. And it's been pretty quiet 2 months in the U.S. and in Canada. But Scott Reid, analyst of CTV News, and I'm going to let you introduce yourself and maybe kick us off into the conversation of what's going on here in Canada, and then we'll bring it back to remind ourselves that we've got some tariff considerations as well.
Sounds good. Thanks a lot, Mike. Thanks everybody. I honestly do not believe that it was 2 months ago. It's not that I can't believe it; it's that I literally refuse to believe it because. When you think about what's occurred, like politically at least, I'll stick to my knitting. Politically, that was surely 14 years ago that we talked because so much has changed. We had a different prime minister. It was a completely different set of projections about how international trade relations, bilateral trade relations would operate, a completely different assumption about when we'd had the next general election. We hadn't had a provincial election in Ontario when we last talked. Like, there's been a lot that's happened. Very quickly, my name is Scott Reid. My background, Mike just mentioned quickly, for folks that follow political news, you may see me occasionally chatting or listening to me on the radio. I work with Bell Media, CTV, so I'm on CTV National News, CTV News Channel, Question Period, chatting about politics as a political analyst. Currently, I run a small consultancy, FestChuck Reid. We focus on executive communications, strategic communications, wide variety of clients. Lots of folks in the financial services sector, but really all sorts of different sectors, folks that have a public affairs focus in particular. But my real credential that's of any interest here is that I spent a number of years at finance when Paul Martin was finance minister. So that really was way more than 14 years ago. That was a whole lifetime ago. But worked for Mr. Martin as finance minister throughout his time there. And then when he was prime minister, and hopefully that brings a little bit of relevant background with respect to bilateral relations, how people look at this stuff through the lens of government and trying to manage these files from the government side, which obviously is an extraordinarily important aspect of how everybody else is moving forward these days, because so much relies upon the instincts of our political decision makers. Even as we know that the White House is set to unroll new tariffs on April 2nd, or maybe not, given how things work these days. But as the investment and business communities watch it all go by, they are to a certain degree, we all are to a certain degree, a little bit hostage to the political events unfolding. You want me to hop just in and just start to roll, right, Mike?
Yeah, I'd go for it. I think, as you said, there was a lot that happened, and as you were saying that, I forgot. Yeah, we have a new prime minister, 2 months, new election. Take us through, like, where really are we at here in Canada? What's going to happen next?
there's lots to say, and I don't know that people want me to just spend the whole thing turning into a political podcast. So I'll try to be quick and make 3 points. One, and I'll start with politics. It really is an extraordinary and exceptional political moment. And every jackass politician I've ever worked for likes to say about the election they're involved in, this is the most important election of our lifetime, the most historic set of choices that we've ever been called upon to make. This is a moment where that rhetoric actually probably registers as the stone cold truth, because it literally is a situation that's virtually without precedent. We suddenly have a prime minister who comes to office with zero political experience. He's had, by the time he calls the election on Sunday, he will have had 1 week of experience in his in office, never having held elected office. I like to call Carney politics adjacent because, as a governor of the Bank of England, governor of the Bank of Canada, he was observing and interacting with elected leaders. Never run for political office until now. So that's an extraordinary and literally unprecedented event. We have the extraordinary aggression of the White House, and I mean, this is, table stakes all of a sudden, but it's worth just saying plainly and out loud again to remind ourselves how bizarre and extraordinary the circumstance we're in. The occupant of the White House is effectively unleashing a trade war on Canada. Our most reliable and dependable partner is now indicating that he wants to exert maximum economic harm on Canada, in part to reward his own country, but in also, by his own confession, because he has ambitions to break us down, bust us up, and annex the parts that he likes. That is a hell of a thing for a president of the United States to say out loud. But that's a situation that we're in, and we may wonder whether that's rhetoric or overstatement. But I think if you're a decision maker, you're obligated to regard it pretty seriously. We have a complete realignment of the political landscape that's happened at light speed in just a couple of months. Mr. Trudeau, gone. Why? Victim of all the circumstance that's actually still unfolding, right? In a situation where we had to deal with Donald Trump and the aggression from the Oval Office, it was no longer possible. The Liberal government, literally members of the government and cabinet, came to the conclusion that they couldn't sustain such an unpopular prime minister. They couldn't actually marshal the public consensus required to move forward at such a time, much less even dream of re-election, much less at that point even imagine that they could avoid political extinction. And now, bang, 2 months later, a 26-point lead, that's according to Nanos polling, 26-point lead for the Conservatives has evaporated into a jump ball election. It is not clear who will win this election. There are polls in the last couple of days that suggest the Liberals could win a majority government. I'm not making any predictions on that. Maybe that momentum carries forward and Mr. Carney's elected prime minister with a majority on the 28th of April. Maybe the laws of political gravity will reassert themselves. Time for a change, and incumbent-itis will claim the Liberals, and Poilievre will end up with a majority government. But I'll make you this prediction. I believe there will be a majority government, one way or the other. As close as the polls look right now, I do not believe this thing will resolve itself with a minority government because the questions are so serious, and all indications are Canadians are looking at it as though it's that serious. And I think there will be a hard decision made one way or another. Third, fourth week of this 5-6 week campaign, I think you'll see a break heavily toward one party or the other. I think people want a government that has firm control and command. So it's an extraordinary, exceptional political moment. Second thing, yes, sir.
Sorry, just to cut in there, because there's something that's on my mind here. 5 years ago, we went into COVID, and it created a tremendously negative economic, or at least that was the view, that it was going to be a high level of economic uncertainty. We now have 5 years later, we're talking government changes and the tariffs.
Yeah.
So how serious and how do we relate what's going on politically through to what we're clearly seeing from your second point there, the White House and the tariffs that are coming? How serious does the government take it, whichever one it leans towards, conservative or otherwise? And then how does that start playing into the Canadian economy? How do we start seeing that?
Yeah, that's exactly the last two quick points I try to make off the top. One, it's dominating and driving almost every single political and government decision, and it will drive this election campaign. But more importantly, it's already begun to drive. It's begun to drive government operations provincially and federally. So let me give you one example, and it's a big one. Everyone actually agrees suddenly, like almost there is a startling degree of consensus, right? Well, we're going to have to marshal countervailing tariffs. There's very few voices that say that we don't have to strike back. There is obviously an overwhelming consensus that we have to eliminate the consumer carbon tax. That's already been done. There's suddenly consensus on tackling interprovincial trade barriers, which was a kryptonite for years and years and years politically. Diversification and locating other markets for trade purposes, on and on and on. So in many respects, there are still differences between the major political parties, but there's suddenly this broad consensus driving so many of these critical questions, leading to the conclusion that eventually the election probably isn't going to be about what, but who. Final thing I would say is to that very same point, this is a really rare moment where action is possible. Often government, lots of talk, lots of promises, not much happens. But events are conspiring in a way that some of these things that did seem like kryptonite and that were untackleable suddenly are going to be mounted. So you look at the moment that I was in 1995, it was almost a rare window of consensus to tackle deficit spending. There wasn't really much consensus either before that or since that in Canadian history that it ought to be done and the sacrifices required are necessary. And yet that happened then. I think we're in a similar moment. I think some of these choices that, how do we deal with tariffs? What are we going to have to do in our own backyard? How are we going to pursue, alternative trade arrangements? I think all of a sudden you're going to see a consensus. Energy infrastructure. I think you're going to see that there's a window of opportunity where government, investment, business will be able to actually move on those priorities and get stuff done. But here's the thing. Those windows don't stay open long. They're unpredictable in their duration. So we're going to have to move quick.
Yeah. And so we'll have a period of time here over the next 45 days-ish where there will be a lot of things I know on the table, whether it be interprovincial trade barriers, and that's a very hot topic of, where does that lead us? We've done some polling of organizations in Canada to get a sense of how much does it actually impact. One of the things that jumped out to me is 95% of our respondents, had regulatory barriers, interprovincially speaking, as a major obstacle to existing growth. And I know I've seen that, show up in the political path and the political trail. Maybe I'll turn the one question here, Brian. I'm going to put you on the spot if you're okay with it. With all of this as the backdrop, right? We've got unprecedented times. We've got people and organizations wondering what to do, how to predict what will be next, which is incredibly difficult to do until we see it play out. We see the paralysis. Maybe we'll take a step back. Where actually are we with the tariffs?
That's a really good question. Can we get the visual up? There we go. Great, thank you. So, Mike, you're right on point. I think there's been a lot happening, as Scott's been alluding to, and in a very short period of time. I agree with the 14 years comment, condensed into 2 months. So when you reflect back, November 25th, 2024. That's the first we heard about the potential tariffs, and we're going to focus on Canada for the moment, and those 25% tariffs that were going to be applied to all Canadian goods. There's been some back and forth since then. Where we stand right now, so what is the current state of the tariffs? Quite simply, we've got 25% tariffs imposed on steel and aluminum that's exported from Canada, imported into the United States. So these are tariffs that the US is imposing on Canadian steel and aluminum. The Canadian reciprocal tariffs that were introduced earlier on, I believe it was March 4th, March 3rd, March 4th, that came into effect and was basically targeted tariffs on $30 billion worth of goods coming from the US into Canada. So these are going to be goods tariffed by Canada in response. And again, targeting predominantly states that and goods that are manufactured or distributed from states where there's strong Republican representation. Where are we going? April 2nd is the next big one, as Scott alluded to. That's when we're expecting to hear whether the proposed tariffs originally suggested on November 25th, reiterated again on January 20, and then reiterated again February 1st, March 4th, and now April 2nd, we will see potentially 25% tariffs on all goods going from Canada to the United States. Again, imposed by the United States. Canada's response to that is to add $125 billion worth of targeted goods that will be tariffed on import from the United States into Canada, again, imposed by Canada. So that's the landscape. That's where we are right now, where we're going. Mike, any questions on that?
Oh, I got tons of questions about where we're going.
All right, let's go.
So I think, and Scott, I'm not going to ask you to predict whether we're going to see the same sort of, exact same government incentive plans that happened in COVID and how things looked like that. But I might come back and ask a question on that in terms of what we might see under different governments. But Brian, clients ask where to go with this, right? There's so much uncertainty. What do I do with it? And there are organizations, I think every organization in Canada is impacted by this, either directly or indirectly, just because of the economic impact. And there's certainly not one client that I've talked to that this is not relevant for them in some way, shape, or form. But for those organizations that are directly impacted, right, one of the notions would be on the tariffs, do you pass it right along to a customer? How do you deal with that? Maybe talk about what you're seeing on some of the strategies that you're seeing with clients.
Yeah, I think there's obviously increased attention to the terms of sale in particular. I would break it down, Mike, into three main buckets. I would say there's the terms of sale consideration that businesses, they have the ability to reflect on and potential control over, and I'll come back to that in a moment. I would say that there's the complexity of goods consideration. How easy can vendors purchasers on both sides of the border pivot and potentially replace suppliers. And then I would say the stability of your supply chain and trade relationship. And so building out the first point around terms of sale, I've talked about this a little bit in the past too, and I think it is one of the critical points that businesses need to understand. You, as a business, have likely entered into agreements already with your suppliers and again, with your customers. Those agreements generally speak to who's responsible for what and where. There's a responsibility quotient here that comes into play, generally referred to as Incoterms. And UCC terms, for those of my vintage that studied accounting back in the 90s, you'll be familiar with FOB, origin, FOB destination, those considerations. However, Incoterms by far globally have taken over. And Incoterms, you would now be more familiar with Ex Works or delivered duty paid. And your agreements will speak to those points. And when you're thinking about it from the context of your purchasing cycle, like if you are purchasing from a vendor elsewhere in the world, and that agreement is subject to a DDP, delivered duty paid arrangement. We'll go with some of the more basic ones for these of example. If you have a fixed pricing on your product that you're purchasing from that vendor, that delivered duty paid could really work to your advantage, because if there's additional tariffs, if tariffs go up or down against Canada, against you as the purchaser, it technically would need to be absorbed by the vendor of those goods, because you have a set price, delivered duty paid. That's how it's going to be. On the flip side of that, if it's Ex Works and now you're purchasing from somebody and you're responsible for those goods from the vendor's docks elsewhere, the opposite to the delivered duty paid concept, at that point in time, you're going to now be subject to those tariffs. So the goods say you purchased something from China, you would be responsible for the pickup of those goods from China, the import into Canada. Any tariffs then would be subject or applied to those goods as they're coming into Canada. Canada would impose those. So that speaks to the control you have. And so it's not as easy as to say, hey, I'm going to pass it along now. If I'm thinking about my selling to my US customer, everything I've just described on the purchase side applies on the sales side too. So now you're selling to your US customer. Are you delivered duty paid? Do you have a set price? Well, then at that point in time, you're probably incurring those tariffs. You're probably absorbing them based on that current agreement if there's no flexibility in there. On the flip side of that, if sex works, your US customer is going to be incurring those tariffs because, again, they're imposed now by the US as the goods move from Canada to the United States. So understanding your agreements, critical before you make any more decisions in that regard. Now, really quickly, complexity of goods. This is something, Mike, you and I have kicked around a little bit, and it actually stems from a dinner conversation. A neighbor was over and we were talking about her particular business and the operations that they have. And there are elements of that business that are complex, and there are elements of that business that are not so complex. And so where they've designed special equipment to cut material and send it to the United States, that US customer can't pivot quickly to replace the Canadian vendor of that product because there's been special equipment designed. And so that US customer now has to find somebody else who can cut that material and receive it either from the United States, likely, or elsewhere. However, it's not going to be easy for them to do. That gives that vendor, assuming again their Incoterms align, kind of step one to step two, it gives that vendor a lot of control over who's absorbing the tariffs. But then that leads me to my third point, which is, do you want to just throw your supply chain away by not playing ball? I think there's a lot of considerations to negotiating and respecting relationships, understanding that, hey, we're all party to this. We're not the ones all making the decisions. There's decisions happening at other tables that affect us, and we can play ball with each other. How long is this going to be? How long is this going to be in place? Do you want to upend your entire supply chain and your customer base simply over what's happening right now? So there's a lot of decisions that have to be made in there.
So I've got two questions just to follow up on that. And I'm, Brian, one's going to be real time. So we'll see where we go with it. We might defer this one, but as you were talking through that, and maybe we'll defer this question to a little bit later, but I know there's a remission process that you can apply to, government on certain elements of the tariffs. Maybe we can talk about that maybe a little bit further down, but you were getting towards, I think that would be a really interesting thing to touch on. But maybe where you're going here on the supply chain, I'll go to my second question. Maybe we come back to the remission piece.
Sure.
There's obviously lots of discussions of where to take your supply chain, right? And obviously, do you relocate to the US? That's been a very hot topic that we've seen. EU has shown up as well as one of those, or UK. Can you talk a little bit about where you see those conversations happening with the clients that you're working with, and what are the factors that are falling into that?
Yeah, you got it. Certainly on your first point about remissions, Charmaine has incredible experience, has had very successful real life examples of where she's assisted clients with that. So that's going to be a great topic to bring Charmaine into in a moment. And it's something everybody wants to pay attention to because this is a real relief measure you can really drive home. So coming to your next point though, really expanding to foreign markets, looking, there's been a lot of discussion. Hey, why aren't we doing more business with the EU, the UK, and why can't we doing more of that? Why aren't we doing more business with Asia Pac, and how could we be doing more? And it is an interesting question because I think what's taking people there, Mike, is this idea that to simply set up shop, to acquire a business in the United States, a manufacturing operation, a distribution center, for example, or completely move your business to the United States. This is something that a lot of businesses, our Canadian businesses, are considering as a point of immunizing themselves, if you will. I would say that requires very careful consideration. It could be a great option for your business. It might be something that you should have thought about a long time before this. However, you do want to consider it's not just as simple as just starting something up or moving your business. There's exit taxes you have to consider and loss positions to take into account. There are repatriation of profit considerations. There's permanent establishment considerations that you want to note as you're, developing out this idea, and that has significant impact on the complexity of your business and the nature of your operations, and even, you think about the employment considerations and the labor requirements. If you're not familiar with that market, there's a lot in play there. It's not as simple as just simply setting up. And I would urge anybody that is considering that to do very little first until you understand your customs costs and understand how truly impacted you are by all of this and the longevity of it. I would then make sure you speak to your international tax advisor, your U.S. corporate tax advisor, mobile workforce advisors, because there's a lot in play. That's in addition to your Canadian tax advisors. So definitely consider that. Now, okay, you want to look at other markets. Well, certainly you've got the comprehensive economic trade agreement that exists with the EU. Fantastic trade agreement. Charmaine can again speak to some of the success we've had with clients that aren't as familiar with that trade agreement. We've all known CUSMA for a while and USMCA, but some of these other ones we were less familiar with. So hey, look at things like the CETA agreement, but that's not going to get you all the way there. Expanding into the EU has other considerations. I think we can all agree that, and certainly from experience, quality requirements in the EU, the regulatory environment are stricter for the most part, okay? But that isn't a game changer because it shouldn't prevent you from doing this, because if you actually look at the labor cost per hour of the G7 countries, we're mid-tier as a country. So we can still produce and sell in Europe for generally cheaper than some of the European countries, as well as North America. So parts of North America, I should say. So there's a yin and a yang to this, and there's certainly some good opportunity in there. So consider the trade agreement, but your hurdles, your barriers are probably going to be around logistics, getting your goods to Europe, and as well as considering the quality and also the regulatory environment. The last point I'll make on that one, Mike, is the supply chain access. Like accessing that supply chain is going to be complicated. You're not familiar with it generally if you haven't done business in those markets, so you got to break into it somehow. This isn't going to be as easy, people, as setting your salespeople on a mission to go find business in these other foreign markets. You're going to have a strategy about how you approach this. You're going to have to understand that market, quality considerations, regulation considerations, as I said, as well as the trade agreements that you want to take advantage of. But all that can come together and potentially put you in an advantageous sales spot and profitability, and that will help you immunize against your overall trade and supply chain.
So listen, Brian, you've said Charmaine's name a few times, so I want to bring her into the conversation.
Good call.
And I'm adding a couple of different questions as I'm seeing and hearing them for Scott. I'd like to come back at some point on the EU stuff, because I think there's a potentially fascinating piece. But Charmaine, maybe I'll kick it over to you here. I think there's a couple of things I'd like to get your comments on. Hearing around how Canadian companies would set up related entities in the U.S. Just to piggyback where Brian was going. But maybe before we get into that, when the news came out on March 4th that there was a pause, it was being reported that the pause came for those items that were already under an existing trade agreement under U.S. MCA and CUSMA. Mm-hmm. But we saw news outlets reporting that really covered only a fraction or a small portion of what the goods could be. Can you maybe just comment on that? Because I think that's one of the confusion points that people may not fully appreciate or understand.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to level set, the March 4th pause that we're talking about here is the pause on the original IEEPA tariffs that the Trump administration alluded to in November of 2024 and then talked about in January, February of 2025. And the idea with the IEEPA tariffs is they were punitive tariffs on both Canada and Mexico. The U.S. was concerned with security issues at the northern and southern border, fentanyl issues, etc. So that's the set of tariffs that we're talking about right now. It is my understanding that the pause really came about because 3 of the large automakers and down the automotive parts chain started to put up their hands and say, "You don't understand, Mr. Trump, how integrated the automotive supply chains are. If we are going to be able to withstand this storm in any capacity, we need a little bit more time." And from that was born this pause. And as you said, it was on goods that qualified under USMCA or CUSMA in Canada. We put the C first, and in Mexico it's referred to as TMEC. And no one wants to hear my Spanish, so let's just go with TMEC. Anyway, and And then we saw the news reports come out, and they started to, toss around this 38% number. Well, this really only impacts 38% of goods coming from Canada, so it's not really that great of a deal. But what, you needed to know a little bit more information to understand where that 38% came from. So let's talk about into the United States. So into the United States, dependent on what product you're importing, your duty rate could go from 0% without any use of any type of free trade agreement. It's inherently duty free, regardless of what it was or is and where it came from, all the way up to 25%. That used to be the highest sort of duty rate that we would see. So if you're a Canadian company and you're manufacturing a good in Canada, and when you sell it into the United States, it's not attracting any duty, you're not going to go through the administrative exercise of qualifying your goods, because it's not as simple as saying, oh, I made it in Canada, therefore it qualifies. No, under USMCA CUSMA, there's actually two types of rules of origin. There's the general ones, and the general ones are if it was mined, grown, the cow out in the pasture, those types of things. That's a pretty easy analysis to do. And that's what we refer to as the general rules. And then there's specific rules, which are generally meant for manufactured goods. So you have to go through this process. There's a tariff determination, there's looking up to see what the rule is, grabbing support from your vendors, possibly. And, companies were in time constraints and, productivity constraints and people restraints. That was just one of those decisions they made and said, we're not going to spend this time manpower over here when we're not saving anything over here. But lo and behold, now they need to pay attention to it because it could be advantageous, to support their claim that it's zero, duty free, or, it would qualify for this pause. And it's certainly important on the go forward, even after April 2nd. We don't really know what that looks like. There's the concept or the threat of reciprocity tariffs, this pause coming off, on and on and on. My advice to clients is still do that USMCA CUSMA exercise, because even on April 2nd, if the pause goes away, you still, potentially can avoid other tariffs. And at this juncture, any amount of money that you can save or a company can save is advantageous for their business. So that's sort of the concept, where that 38% came out, and things that are inadvertently, or not inadvertently, are just duty free, not inadvertently duty free.
I agree with you, Charmaine, on that too, because I think that this has shone a light on compliance to the USMCA CUSMA. Businesses need to be paying attention to their compliance with that, and I think we could see more action on the part of both customs authorities.
Yeah, I actually have a further comment on there too, because as I'm talking to some companies, they're like, well, we qualified under NAFTA, so, it'll just be easy. We already know. And I say to them, but CUSMA USMCA is not NAFTA. There was changes, and there's probably been changes to your supply chain. And guess what? Canadian and US Customs are auditing certificates. We have 3 USMCA audits on the go right now, even before this started. So yes, document retention and support, absolutely paramount if you're going to use CUSMA USMCA.
So, Charmaine, one of the things that has struck me through the past 2 months, one of the actions that we've seen organizations doing, and I say it, I could say it with air quotes, is waiting, right? Which isn't really an action or an activity, but I understand with the high level of uncertainty. What we have started to see, and you and I were connecting just beforehand, is that organizations are establishing a tolerance for how much uncertainty they're willing to sustain. Yes. And we are now starting to see some actions, whether it be making some decisions around investments and saying we can't wait any longer, the business is too important, we're going to make we're going to restructure, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into our customs and excise tax positioning. Can you maybe talk about what are some of the things that you are seeing specific to the tariffs around strategies that you're seeing organizations take to mitigate and not only mitigate the tariffs that are there, but the potential for where things can go so they can establish sort of that tolerance for uncertainty?
Yep. And if you'll all bear with me, I'm going to give a real life client example that is turning out really good for that client. So just to set the stage, they have a US parent, they have a Canadian sub, and then they have their customers in the United States that they sell to. Either the Canadian entity sells to or the US parent company sells to. And the flow of goods, so they're in the steel and aluminum, so very topical right now. They import steel and aluminum components and some other components into Canada, do some manufacturing, and then ship back to the United States. Before we got involved, they would have been paying 25% additional duties into Canada under the steel and aluminum reciprocal tariffs that we have in Canada. And then in turn, they would have been paying 25% back into the US with the potential on April 2nd to be paying an additional 25%. And they came to us and Charmaine, said, Charmaine, what can we do here? We just can't, that we cannot withstand this. And I said, okay, well, here's the starting point. I said, what do you know about your supply chain? What's coming in and out? And they said, well, not a lot. And I said, well, how about we start with our TOVA product? How about we take your import data, load it in, and level set, what you're doing, who you're buying from, and then we'll start to look at what some duty mitigation strategies would be. So for them, on the Canadian side, we're using two duty mitigation strategies. One is the remissions, the remission program that you spoke to, and either Brian and I will discuss that in further detail in a minute. And then into Canada, even with our punitive and reciprocal tariffs, the Canadian government is still allowing duty drawback or duty deferral. And duty drawback is, in short, if you pay duties when a good was imported into Canada, that good does not remain in Canada, either in its form or manufactured into a good, you can claim that duty back from the Canadian government. Now, I will say on the flip side, the US government is not allowing that. And the duty deferral program is, you have to start with an application to the Canada Border Services Agency. But if you're accepted into that program, what it says is if you're manufacturing goods that will leave the country using inputs that came into the country, you can defer payment of those goods or the duty on those goods and only pay if for some reason those goods stayed in Canada. So we've got them set up. We've got a remission application in right now, and we're just in the decision process of drawback versus duty deferral. But we have now mitigated their duty to zero upon import into Canada. Awesome. So what do we do on the US side? Well, on the US side, there are a couple of exemptions available in very small cases, and it has to do with the steel or aluminum. If it was melted, poured, smelted, cast, and I might have that backwards, but we kind of get the gist of that. In the United States, came into Canada for further processing and then left, there's exemptions into the United States in those circumstances, acknowledging that a big chunk of the good is manufactured using steel or aluminum from the United States. So as it stands today, zero into Canada, zero into the United States. Big win, clients happy. But now we want to prepare them for, that's the short term, right? That's the Band-Aid, that's the short-term solution. Now we're preparing them for the long-term solution. And what that looks like is a brainstorming workshop with where we get, as Brian, you talked about earlier, international tax, transfer pricing, our supply chain management or the old ESG group, the strategy, value creation, and analytics group, and myself, and sometimes someone from, one of my US colleagues, and we all sit together in a room or on a call like this and say, okay, this is what we're working with. What can we do long-term strategies to mitigate costs? Look at different supply chains, looking at, maybe using your US parent company in a larger capacity. And then from that meeting, then, we figure out what they have the appetite to do, right? And once we figure out that, we've got a solid plan, and everybody goes off and, does what they need to do to help that client. So that, the takeaway there is the remissions, the exemptions, etc. They're somewhat short term, but you really need to start looking at the long term. And I have to admit, we're getting there. Some of the paralysis is wearing off, and I do see a movement of companies, and yeah, this isn't going away. Yeah, I believe you, Charmaine. The international trade landscape has forever changed, and it's not just the Trump administration, right? It's what happened in the Suez Canal. It's the threat of, another pandemic, and on and on and on. They really need to figure out the long-term strategy. So again, as I started, not only survive but thrive.
Okay, I've got a bunch of follow-up questions that I'd like to ask on that one, but I'm going to ask it in a different way. But I'm going to go to Scott first on something in a second. So Charmaine, I'm going to just give you the heads up. There was an interesting question that popped up there that I'd like to come back to. It caught my eye around SaaS businesses or purchasing software from the US. I'm going to come back on that one just because I know there's been a bunch of questions of how does that, potentially, if it is goods and management fees and transfer pricing, that I might get you to comment on. Not that they're the same thing, but I can see the parallels to it. But I'll come back on that one. Scott, I want to ask, that was my way of giving you a little bit of time to think of a good answer for it, Charmaine. You didn't catch that. Scott, I'd like to come back on the economic packages, because there is some paralysis that we see in the marketplace, that we see in the Canadian economy of not making decisions. We're seeing a little bit of it wear off and some things starting to move, but in sort of small pieces. How big is the economic packages landing, or do you think they'll land as part of the campaigns, either Conservative or Liberals? Can you comment on that?
I think for the next 38 days, you're going to see people be relatively vague on both sides of the political fence, just because people won't want to specify for fear that what they project won't fit the moment. And they could overshoot and promise spending that's not necessary or prudent, or that they could undershoot. So I think you'll hear broad assertions of we will be there for individuals, for industry, and to help people through it. In truth, I think that's going to manifest itself in a couple of ways. And one of them is particularly relevant to folks on this call, I think. The first is general support packages. So what happens for those that are really sideswiped by it? What's the relative way of providing some kind of support for folks to help them, using the federal treasury to help them get through what could be tough times? And there will be tough times, presumably, if Trump proceeds. But the second is what alterations, what changes might be made, and how might that help? What opportunities would be created? And that's where understanding your business as a process of going through and trying to tariff-proof might also lead you to, what would work? What would be awfully darn good if there was this kind of allowance through federal regulation, or this sort of fund, or this kind of mechanism. So starting to think about those things. I would keep a piece of foolscap in my desk where I write down could be what seem like crazy ideas right now. But in a moment of crisis, no idea is crazy. No ask is necessarily too large to put on the table. So think about that. Final thing point I'd want to make real quick is, although, by the way, the real honest answer to your question is I think we're going to spend big, because I think these things are going to hit big. And I do think we're going to see the federal treasury unleashed, because I don't know that there's much else. And I think the dollar is going to take a kicking, because that's our other obvious circuit breaker and buffer. I would just say to your point about people's tolerance for uncertainty, it's so important, because you need to do two things, not one thing. One, you need to tariff-proof your business. So that's going to like the Charmaines and Brians of the world, getting the best possible advice on tax, on customs, on duty mitigation strategies, thinking about your supply chain, sourcing it, fortifying that, getting as much cash as possible so you have as much flexibility as possible, all those things that sound business people do. But you're also going to have to Trump-proof. And that's harder. And what that means is you're going to have to live with unpredictability. What's going to happen on April 2nd? Beats the living hell out of me. And no one else knows. March 4th is instructive. Listen to what Charmaine said, right? On March 4th, they had to retreat within 36 hours because automakers said, hey, we're a very integrated industry. Well, guess what? I knew that before March 4th. I would have thought that the people imposing tariffs did as well. It goes to show you that they know what they want to do as a matter of policy outcome. But how it's going to get, so all the questions on the side about, well, how's this going to impact software and what will and what won't be eligible, they don't know and we don't know. And we don't even know if Trump will impose sweeping tariffs on the whole world on April 2nd, including Canada and Mexico, on top of what else has happened to us. And then say, all right, now come to us and beg, borrow, and negotiate on a bilateral basis, and we'll strike bilateral arrangements that will have a complete patchwork quilt application across a variety of places. And that's going to require a lot of courage on people's parts, because what it means is we aren't going to know the rules of the game, and we aren't going to know what does and doesn't apply. We won't even know it on April 3rd.
So, yeah, I think it's, there was a comment that came up earlier of if anyone can perfectly predict, they're probably not 100% there. That being said, getting ready for your level of assessing what your own level of tolerance for uncertainty is something that is within your control. I did want to come back to that question, though, Charmaine, of services and sort of as you cross border. And Brian, it might be for you too, so I don't want to just point it one way, but can you talk historically about how some of the tariffs have worked on services, or and I've seen some other considerations of different pricing practices of changing the price of goods and using services to help balance that. Can you? I'll throw it to both of you. Maybe just comment on what that could look like.
Yeah, so it's okay, Brian. I'm going to start, and I'm actually going to punt it to you, and you'll know exactly when I'm about to punt it to you. So generally, duties are applied on physical goods that cross the border, not services. And it's actually noted right in the USMCA CUSMA agreement that services don't attract any type of tariffs. However, and I'm saying this because it is actually noted in the USMCA, and what we know is we're coming up to a renegotiation of USMCA and CUSMA, and we should expect that there will be negotiation rhetoric discussion around this, and also the digital services tax, which we know is another burr in the Trump administration, and honestly, it kind of was in the Biden administration as well. So I expect this, the topic of services, to be part of the USMCA negotiation and to have a lot of discussion around it between the two countries. Brian?
Yeah, no, I like you the introduction of the digital services tax considerations. You're right on point. We were fielding interviews around this last August, and there was a lot of concern on the part of businesses and the government based on what was coming out of the United States and the concerns that they had with the digital services tax. What's interesting about that, though, it is a driving force, and it is. I would say offensive is not an incorrect term for American business and the American government that digital services tax is there, but Canada is a late arrival to the digital services landscape. My peers in the industry will agree that this we were a latecomer, and generally speaking, it is we're talking high value dollars that are going businesses that are going to be included in that. You're talking was it 750 million euro, $1 billion roughly of global revenue that has to be earned by the business, and then there has to be $20 million of core source revenue specifically related to Canada. So we're talking about a specific type of business that is affected by that. However, I would say that unfortunately, we haven't done ourselves any favors with the digital services tax introduction. I would be interested to see how it lasts. But I won't spend too much time on there. If I can, I'd love to come back to a comment that Scott made around the relief measures and the concerns there. I personally, I think there needs to be more there. I love the point about the Treasury needs to be unleashed. I think, and politics aside, thinking just about what's advantageous for Canadian business, I think we need to see Susan Sir's style, like the Canadian Emergency Wage Subsidy and rent subsidy style relief come into play in the near future to help businesses that may find themselves having to potentially lay off staff, that will have difficulty remaining a going concern if we see what's coming in April 2nd, if we see 25% tariff. So, and I know that that's not going to be popular with everybody. It's going to, increase deficits. However, it gives us the opportunity. And of course, we now know that what we learned in economics back in the day, again, that doesn't hold true anymore. And we could see inflationary effect and other things that come from that. And we might be battling that again. However, I think that's good for the livelihood of Canada.
Okay, Brian, thanks. We've got just a couple of minutes left. And, you talk about going back, to economics class. I kind of feel like the moment we're in is kind of like, when you haven't had an assignment in school, you didn't 100% know what good looked like. There was a couple of things to do. One is do your homework, right? Roll up your sleeves and do your homework about what you can do for yourself. And what was the other thing that I know I did, which was you ask for help. You go in and you talk to others. You either ask for help or you go in and you talk to other people about what challenges you're seeing, peers or otherwise. And I think that would certainly be one of the things that we've seen is even if you don't know what to do, just talk to others and say, hey, what could that look like? So to the extent that we'll open the poll and then I'll bring it back, like to the extent you just want to talk to somebody about this, what's going on in your business. I've seen some really great questions in there. I apologize, we can't get to all those questions, some a little bit more detailed than others. Happy to have those conversations. So we'll open a poll if you want to go through it. I know we're wrapping up here and I want to make sure that we give some time. So is the poll open? I think so. Yes. Okay. So if you'd like to speak to somebody at BDO, just to talk it through, by all means, interested to see what people feel on that. That is, yeah. Go ahead, Brian.
I was just going to say, Mike, another thing that I know Charmaine has mentioned this in many times with clients, also on webinars and opportunities where I can be public facing. Networking with your associations, folks. Connect in with the people in your industry. Maybe Charmaine, if you want to build out on that a little bit briefly, because I think you say it best.
Thank you. No, absolutely. I always say that the group voice is louder than the singular voice. And I've been doing a lot of work with some of the industry groups in Canada and going to be speaking to some of them over the next few weeks. And the idea there is you get to have your voice heard, right? And they're taking down all of the things that you're saying and all of the concerns, and they're creating these submissions to the Canadian government. So they're your voice. They, and they're large advocacy groups. They will be heard. So if you want to have your voice heard, certainly, as you suggested, make sure you get in touch with your local industry group.
Okay, so we are really near time. Scott, I want to say thank you so much. Always a pleasure to have your voice and your opinion on where things are at. I know it's changing frantically. I always look forward to, I get a nice little email from Scott most weeks that gives me the sneak peek of what might be. And I come back and I haven't never had to come back and say you're wrong. So thank you for that.
Well, wrong with that. Thanks a lot.
Brian, Charmaine, thank you so much. We are here available. You guys want to chat about any of this? I love the suggestions going to different associations, Brian and Charmaine. That's a great thing to do. Don't tackle these issues yourself, right? This is a really tough time. Talk to anyone, but we'd be happy to talk more about what we're seeing with other organizations. I don't believe there's any two organizations that will face the issue directly or indirectly the exact same. So getting the homework done and understanding what's going to be unique to you, I think is going to be critical. All right. With that, thank you, everyone. Brian, Charmaine, Scott.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
That's fun.
And thanks to all the attendees.